Okay. Let's see. Chapter 20. So remember, we just finished chapter 19. That chapter 19 was population ecology, right? And remember, a population is a group of the same species living together, you know, experiencing the same conditions, competing for the same resources. Now we're just going to bump it up a notch and talk about communities. And then a step above that, which is ecosystems. So let's jump into it. And I guess the first word for attendance for the video, will be I don't know, chapter, since it's up there. Chapter will be the first word for this video. Anyway, see, this is another long chapter, so that's why I wanted to go ahead and get a head start on it. It's 4 bullet points long, main bullet points. So we're going to talk about biodiversity, which is such an important topic. We're talking about community ecology, which again is a step up from population ecology. And then a step up from that will be ecosystem ecology. And then finally, we'll wrap it all up. The entire semester, we'll wrap it up together with conservation and restoration biology. So here we go. Biodiversity. What is biodiversity? Does anybody know what biodiversity is? Or can anybody try to guess? I'm sure you've heard of it. You're probably just thinking, all right, I know this word, but how would I say it in a biology class? So does anybody want to have a stab at it? Nope. All right. Well, basically, it's just the variety of living things, right? And we're going to get in, it's a little bit deeper than that, but that's the most basic way you should think of it. It's the variety of living things. So know that before you even add the rest of the details, right? Know that biodiversity is the variety of living things. Again, like I said, it gets a little bit deeper. You don't need to write any of these down because we're going to discuss them separately. But if we're talking about the variety of living things, that includes genetic diversity, which will make sense here shortly. Species diversity, which is, I think, what most people think of when they think of biodiversity. And then also ecosystem diversity. So basically, we start very narrow and then we just kind of make it broad, right? As genetic diversity is very narrow, and then ecosystem diversity is very broad. Anyway, again, this is just the introduction, so I'm not even going to ask if you have any questions yet. The first one we're going to talk about is genetic diversity, and I've mentioned this before. We talked about this, and when we talked about sexual selection, we talked about this when we talked about natural selection. We talked about this when we talked about mitosis, right? Crossing over and independent assortment, all that. It's all coming back. So here we go. Genetic diversity in a population is basically the variation in alleles. So remember, alleles are different versions of genes. So what we're saying here is we all have generally the same genes, right? Every individual in a population, generally speaking, is going to have the same genes. However, there will be variations of those genes, right? And those are the alleles, right? So you might have the allele for a brown eye, or you might have alleles for blue eyes, for example, that you should be familiar with from the lab. As you already know, this genetic diversity is the raw material that makes microevolution and adaptation, aka natural selection. It's all about genetic diversity. Without genetic diversity, we couldn't have these things, right? Populations wouldn't change. Populations couldn't adapt to changes in their environment. They would just go extinct. So if a population is lost, right? So remember, a population is a group of the same species that are living in the same area at the same time. So get your mind out of thinking about humans for a second and just remember that a population does not necessarily mean all the species, all the individuals of that species on Earth. And the example I used was, I think I was talking about the squirrels, right? Like the squirrels in Florida versus the squirrels in West Virginia. Those are different populations. So we could lose the entire population of squirrels in West Virginia, for example. But still, the squirrels wouldn't be extinct all over, right? Because there's still squirrels in other places. That's what we mean by a population in this context. But anyway, if a population is lost, obviously, the number of individuals in that species declines. That's obvious, right? If you lost a whole population, you're going to lose just straight up numbers. But more importantly, I don't know about more importantly, but also importantly, you lose genetic resources for that species because, again, just using the squirrels as an example, the squirrels are probably, you could probably look at their gene pool, you could probably look at their variations in alleles and tell that they're related, right? You could probably look at the population of the West Virginia squirrels and then versus the population of the Florida squirrels and look at their genomes and be like, yeah, I can tell they're the same species, but I can tell that they're also separate populations because, again, they just have different, probably have slightly different genetic resources. And that's a very bad thing because once you lose genetic resources, that threatens the survival of the species. For a human example, when we're talking about genetic diversity, again, I've used this example before, but think about COVID-19, right? Now, granted, a lot of it has nothing to do with genetics, right? It could be the strand of COVID that you got. It could be your pre-existing conditions, but a lot of it probably did have a lot to do with genetics. So there were some people where COVID was just deadly. Like genetically, there was something in them, in their alleles that made COVID deadly. Meanwhile, um, other people just, they didn't even have symptoms, right? And then obviously everywhere in between. So that's the beauty and the importance of genetic diversity because you have a population that can sustain these changes. Now, what if there was something that happened in the human population and we lost a lot of people? And let's just say by chance, the ones that made it were the people who are also genetically predisposed to COVID. Then we'd be basically screwed, right? Because then COVID would be just a deadly disease for everybody in the human population just because we lost genetic diversity. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions? It's a very important concept. It's all about the gene pool. It's all about having a deep gene pool. Anyway, I use this cheetah as an example. You can also click on it and watch a video, a little short video about cheetahs and genetic diversity. But the reason I used cheetahs as the example was because we talked about them in a previous chapter when we talked about the bottleneck effect. Anyway, let's move forward. So genetic diversity also has economic value. There's something called bioprospecting, which is when it's the potential development of new medicines and industrial chemicals, other stuff. It's basically, right, is when you're looking at genetic diversity to fix common day problems. This is why I use these bananas as an example. You might not know this, but there used to be other varieties of bananas, and they've all pretty much gone extinct. And another thing you might not know about bananas is when you look at these bananas, these are the same ones you would see at your Kroger. They're basically clones of each other. Like when you talk about genetic diversity, this is the opposite of that. They are genetically unique. And what's happened is, they're called Cavendish bananas. What's happened is there's a disease going out there basically that affects them. And there is no like natural immunity for any of them because again, they're basically all clones. So if it affects one of them, then they're all going to be affected by it. So that's just a great example of why genetic diversity is important because here we have these clones, and if they're now under threat of being completely wiped out because they have no genetic diversity, and this particular pathogen is deadly to every single one of them. And again, what some people are doing, they're doing some bioprospecting. They're looking at maybe some wild bananas that are not good to eat, but they haven't been cultivated. So they're looking at those genomes and trying to find some alleles that they could use and kind of mix and match some things to hopefully create a banana that is resistant to it. And I know that might not seem like a big deal because you might be like, oh, big deal, no more bananas. But, that's just one food source. If that keeps happening, it would be a bad thing. It's also a good independent work topic if you want to look into it. What other foods are under threat because of a lack of genetic diversity? Like I think off the top of my head, I have to look this up. It's coffee and or chocolate might be under threat because again, very little genetic diversity and there's a disease out there that's killing it off. But anyway, there won't be any questions about Cavendish bananas on the exam. Just know that genetic diversity is important and know what it is. So any questions about this slide? All right. The next one, again, I think this is the one that people think of when they think of biodiversity. This is the easy one, species diversity. Before I tell you what it is, I'll go through the book introduction. Your book points out that we are pushing species towards extinction. The present rate of extinction is 100 times higher than at any time in the past 100,000 years. Basically, what we're saying here is species always go extinct. That's always been a thing. But your book is saying that it's happening much higher now than it has in the past 100,000 years, right? So kind of a big deal. And your book also gets a little bit specific. It says that at the current rate, over 1/2 of all plant and animal species might be gone by the end of the century. That's just from your book. I don't know if that's how accurate that is, or even the better way of putting it is, that's from back when the book was published. So things might be a little bit different now. Your book gives some examples. Hector's dolphin have recently gone extinct. So that's a species that has gone extinct in your lifetime. The clouded leopard at the time of publication was extinct. They thought it was, and I left it in here, but someone has found some. So it turns out they're not extinct. Then there's some non-book examples that I looked up. West African black rhinos have died recently or gone extinct. Passenger pigeons, which are from the United States. Carolina parakeets, which are from the United States. And it is 8:50. So I will finish this off with the last attendance word, which will be desk. And we will get back up on Monday with chapter 20. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, I will be online for office hours if anybody needs me. It's time to get ready. We've got 1 week left, so I'll try to be available if you guys need my help over the weekend.